Operation Gothic Serpent, Black Hawk down. Context and buildup. Into the heart of Mogadishu. In the early 1990s, Somalia was a country torn apart. The collapse of its central government in 1991 plunged the nation into chaos as rival clans and warlords battled for control. Famine swept through the land, killing hundreds of thousands. Amid the anarchy, one warlord rose to dominate the capital of Mogadishu, Mohammed Farah Aidid, leader of the Harrowing clan. International attention turned toward the growing humanitarian catastrophe. In 1992, the United Nations launched Operation Restore Hope, a peacekeeping mission backed by the United States to ensure aid reached the starving population. Initially, it worked. Food was distributed and violence subsided, but the fragile stability didn't last. Aidid, suspicious of foreign intervention, began attacking UN forces. In June 1993, 24 Pakistani peacekeepers were ambushed and killed, an act that galvanized Washington. The U.S. response was Operation Gothic Serpent, a mission with a narrow but high-risk objective: capture or kill Aidid and dismantle his command network. The core of this operation was a highly trained strike force, Task Force Ranger, composed of U.S. Army Rangers, Delta Force operators, Navy SEALs, and Night Stalkers from the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment. Their base of operations was the Mogadishu Airport, a makeshift fortress surrounded by sandbags and barbed wire. Intelligence pinpointed Aidid's network operating from deep within the Bakara market, a dense urban sprawl in the heart of Mogadishu. Streets were narrow, unpredictable, and filled with both armed militias and civilians. It was a place where every rooftop could be a sniper nest and every alley an ambush site. By October 1993, after several failed attempts to capture Aidid or his top lieutenants, tensions were rising. The political pressure to achieve results was mounting. Intelligence finally indicated that two of Aidid's top commanders would be meeting at a specific location in Bakara Market. The time to strike had come. On October 3, 1993, Task Force Ranger was given the green light. The plan was designed to be swift and surgical. Insert Delta Force operators by helicopter directly onto the target building, secure the suspects, and extract via convoy and helicopters within 30 minutes. The team was confident. Most had seen combat, and their training was unmatched. The mission was meant to be routine. Dangerous, yes, but not exceptional. But what they didn't know was that this day would turn into one of the most intense and harrowing firefights in modern American military history. The city was waiting. Armed militias roamed the streets, watching the sky. The people of Mogadishu had seen foreign troops come and go. But this time, the rules of engagement would be different. And for the men of Task Force Ranger, what started as a mission to capture two targets would become a battle for survival in the heart of a hostile city. The mission begins targeting the Harrowing leadership. On the afternoon of October 3, 1993, Mogadishu's sweltering air hummed with tension. At precisely 15:32 local time, the signal was given: execute the mission. Black Hawk helicopters thundered over the city as MH-6 Little Birds skimmed the rooftops. Below, in the heart of Bakara Market, the target building, an unremarkable concrete structure, held two of Aidid's top lieutenants. Task Force Ranger was about to strike. The operation began like clockwork. 4 Black Hawks dropped ropes over the target, and Delta Force operators fast roped directly onto the rooftop and surrounding streets. Seconds later, a ground convoy of Humvees and flatbed trucks raced from the airport, packed with Army Rangers tasked with securing the perimeter and facilitating extraction. Speed was crucial. Every second spent on the ground increased the risk of ambush. Within minutes, Delta operators stormed the building. The suspects were apprehended without incident, and the first phase of the mission seemed to be a success. On the perimeter, Rangers manned intersections, providing cover and fending off curious civilians. But in Mogadishu, the line between civilian and combatant was razor thin. Word spread quickly. The Americans were making a move. Suddenly, the city began to shift. Armed militias mobilized. Men poured into the streets with AK-47s, RPGs, and technical vehicles mounted with machine guns. The calm before the storm had ended. Back in the air, the Black Hawks hovered in tight formation. From above, pilots had a clear view of the growing danger, but on the ground, visibility was limited. Then, without warning, an RPG screamed skyward and struck one of the Black Hawks, Super 6-1, piloted by Chief Warrant Officer Threecliffe Wolcott. The tail rotor exploded. The aircraft spun uncontrollably and crashed several blocks away, kicking up a cloud of debris and chaos. Immediately, the mission's objective changed. What began as a rapid snatch and grab was now a rescue and recovery operation. A team of Rangers and Delta operators was rerouted on foot to reach the crash site. Meanwhile, the ground convoy, now facing increasing gunfire and roadblocks, struggled to maintain position. Navigation became difficult in the winding maze of the city, GPS was limited, and hostile fire intensified. Then the unthinkable happened again. A second Black Hawk, Super 6-4, piloted by Chief Warrant Officer Mike Durant, was hit by another RPG and crashed deeper into the city. Durant's bird went down hard, far from any immediate support. Isolated and surrounded, he and his crew were in mortal danger. From that moment, the battle spiraled. Communications began to break down. Teams were scattered. Ammunition ran low. Still, the soldiers pressed forward. Evacuation of the first crash site became a desperate fight as forces dug in and held their position against waves of enemy fighters. Command back at the Joint Operations Center scrambled reinforcements. Requests were made to UN partners for armored support, but delays mounted. Time was slipping away, and Task Force Ranger was now facing a citywide uprising. The original 30-minute plan was in ruins. Now it was about survival, holding the line, rescuing the wounded, and getting every man out alive. In the heart of Mogadishu, what began as a textbook operation had become a chaotic, high-stakes battle that would test the limits of courage and endurance. Disaster strikes, the fall of the Black Hawks. As Super 6-1's wreckage smoldered and the dust began to settle, reality set in. This was no longer a controlled operation. This was a battlefield, and Task Force Ranger was at the epicenter of an all-out street war. The once confident momentum of the mission was replaced by confusion, fear, and urgency. The downing of Super 6-1 triggered the immediate dispatch of a quick reaction force on foot, Rangers and Delta operators sprinting through Mogadishu's narrow alleys toward the crash. Under constant gunfire, they encountered ambush after ambush. Every street corner became a choke point, every rooftop a threat. The original objective had been to capture 2 men. Now it was about defending fellow soldiers stranded in hostile territory. As these forces fought their way to the first crash site, another shockwave rippled through the air. Super 6-4 had gone down. CW-3 Mike Durant's Black Hawk had taken a direct hit from an RPG, its rotor severed in midair. The aircraft slammed into the ground miles from the nearest friendly position. Unlike the first crash, no immediate rescue team was nearby. Durant and his crew were surrounded, and the city was closing in. Durant radioed for help, but it was clear the odds were against him. 2 Delta Force snipers, Sergeant First Class Randy Shugart and Master Sergeant Gary Gordon, volunteered to insert at the crash site to protect the crew, fully aware they were likely sacrificing their lives. With only their rifles and unwavering resolve, they fought off wave after wave of enemy fighters, giving Durant precious minutes to survive. Both were killed in action. Their bravery would later be honored with the Medal of Honor. Back at the first crash site, U.S. forces had managed to establish a defensive perimeter, but the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Ammunition was running low. Communications were unreliable. The planned extraction convoy had been ambushed and forced to retreat. For the men on the ground, it was now a waiting game. Hold out until relief could arrive or die trying. Meanwhile, the streets of Mogadishu transformed into a death trap. Somali fighters, emboldened by the downed helicopters, surged into the fight. Technicals mounted with heavy weapons roamed freely. Civilians, some armed, some just caught in the chaos, moved through the battlefield. The American soldiers, trained for precision, had to balance return fire with the moral weight of avoiding civilian casualties in a crowded war zone. Night fell over Mogadishu, but there was no relief. Tracer rounds lit up the sky. Radio chatter was thick with calls for medics, for air support, for help. The Black Hawk wrecks were under siege. The extraction teams were pinned, and reinforcements were still hours away. Medical evacuations were improvised under fire. Wounded soldiers bled in alleyways while their comrades held the line. It was a disaster unfolding in real time. By midnight, the situation was critical. The United States called upon the United Nations coalition forces, including Pakistani tanks and Malaysian armored vehicles, to help mount a final rescue. But their arrival was still hours away. Until then, the men of Task Force Ranger were alone. What had begun as a precise 30-minute mission had now devolved into a grueling 15-hour firefight. The cost in lives and strategy was mounting. And yet, through it all, those on the ground held their positions, refusing to abandon their wounded, their fallen, or their duty. The fall of the Black Hawks changed everything. Not just the battle, but the way the U.S. military would approach urban warfare for years to come. And the darkest hours of this night were still ahead. Urban survival. Fighting through the night as the sun set over Mogadishu, the city became a nightmarish labyrinth of shadows, smoke, and gunfire. For the men trapped at the crash sites, the darkness offered no concealment, only deeper uncertainty. Their infrared goggles allowed them to see but not to rest. Every minute brought new threats, every alley a new ambush. The once confident Task Force Ranger was now fighting to survive, block by block, heartbeat by heartbeat. At the first crash site, a makeshift defensive perimeter had been established. Rangers and Delta operators dug in among the ruins of the helicopter, laying down suppressive fire from behind debris, bullet-riddled vehicles, and shattered walls. Medics worked under fire to treat the wounded. Blood soaked the ground. Grenades were passed hand to hand like lifelines. There was no retreat, only the hope of holding out until reinforcements arrived. Radio contact with command was patchy at best. Air support was limited. Little birds still made daring strafing runs through narrow streets, but even they had to be cautious amid the dense urban sprawl and constant ground fire. Ammunition was running dangerously low. Water and medical supplies were nearly gone, yet morale somehow held. Meanwhile, other Ranger and Delta teams, scattered across Mogadishu, were equally under siege. Some had become separated from the main force during the chaos of the initial assault and crash. These isolated squads were forced to navigate the city blindly, engaging hostiles as they tried to link up with their comrades or find cover. Many were wounded, some were lost, but none gave up. At the crash site of Super 6-4, the silence was deafening. The heroic stand by Gary Gordon and Randy Sugar had bought Mike Durant time, but not rescue. Alone and badly injured, Durant was eventually captured by Somali militia and taken prisoner. His fate unknown, a shadow of fear hung over the entire operation. Back at the airport command center, efforts to mount a full-scale rescue had reached a desperate pitch. Calls were made to allied UN forces. Malaysian armored personnel carriers and Pakistani tanks were finally mobilized. But coordinating the joint extraction force took time. Time the men on the ground didn't have. By 200 hours, the relief convoy was on its way. Yet the soldiers at the crash sites were not informed when, or if, it would arrive. For them, the fight continued unabated. The Somali militias, growing more emboldened with each passing hour, launched wave after wave of attacks. RPGs exploded inches from cover. Mortars fell nearby. The enemy was relentless, swarming in greater numbers than anticipated, driven by a mixture of nationalism, vengeance, and raw aggression. Inside the defensive cordon, camaraderie held the men together. They shared bullets, morphine, water. They told jokes to push back fear. They held the line not because they had to, but because the man next to them needed them to. This wasn't just a military operation anymore. It had become an endurance trial, a test of will, brotherhood, and belief. Urban survival meant more than tactics. It meant grit, loyalty, and the refusal to leave a fallen comrade behind. As the horizon finally began to brighten with the first pale light of dawn, the sound of tanks rolling through Mogadishu's shattered streets signaled that help, at long last, was near. But even with daylight, the most difficult part still awaited: the extraction. Extraction and aftermath. A mission redefined. As dawn broke over Mogadishu on October 4, 1993, The city's streets revealed the aftermath of a brutal night of combat. Smoke curled from shattered buildings. The wail of injured civilians echoed across alleyways pockmarked by bullets and scorched by RPG blasts. And in the heart of it all, American forces, wounded, exhausted, but still fighting, waited for salvation. The long-awaited rescue convoy, composed of Malaysian armored personnel carriers, Pakistani tanks, and a team of U.S. 10th Mountain Division soldiers, finally reached the outer edge of the embattled zone. It had taken hours to assemble, coordinate, and push through the maze-like city streets under sporadic fire. The plan was clear: extract the pinned-down Rangers and Delta operators, recover the wounded, and pull back to the UN base. But even this final phase proved agonizing. In a city now fully awake and alert to the Americans' presence, hostilities continued. Snipers fired from rooftops. Militias attacked the convoy from alleys and intersections. Navigating through the debris-laden streets to the crash sites was painfully slow. Some Rangers had to run behind armored vehicles on foot, exposed and under fire, many of them dehydrated, wounded, and carrying fallen comrades. By late morning, the perimeter around Super 6-1 had finally been relieved. Survivors were loaded onto vehicles, some carried, some crawling, some walking with shattered limbs. Medics worked frantically as the convoy rolled back toward the stadium complex that housed UN forces, but not all had made it out. The second crash site, where Mike Durant and his crew went down, remained inaccessible. Durant had been captured by AIDED's militia and was being held as a prisoner of war. For the men of Task Force Ranger, this was a bitter blow. They had fought for hours, taken immense risks, and endured unspeakable horrors. But one of their own was still out there. By the time the survivors reached safety, 18 American soldiers were dead, over 70 wounded, and hundreds of Somali casualties lay in the streets. The bodies of Gordon and Shugart, who had voluntarily defended Durant's crash site, were recovered later. Their sacrifice would become legend. The political fallout was immediate. Graphic images of dead American soldiers being dragged through the streets of Mogadishu were broadcast worldwide. Public opinion in the United States turned sharply against the mission. Within months, President Clinton ordered a full withdrawal of U.S. forces from Somalia. Aidid remained in power until his death in 1996, but the impact of Operation Gothic Serpent echoed far beyond that day. In military circles, the battle reshaped doctrine for urban warfare, joint operations, and special forces deployment. Training programs were rewritten. Equipment was upgraded. The Pentagon realized that even the best-trained soldiers could be undone by flawed planning, weak intelligence, and underestimating the enemy. For those who survived, the battle became a scar etched in memory, a symbol of sacrifice, brotherhood, and the brutal unpredictability of war. Many would later speak about the unbreakable bond forged in those 18 hours, about the clarity of purpose in the middle of chaos, and the price paid for valor. What was meant to be a short surgical strike had turned into one of the most intense battles in modern U.S. history. A stark reminder that in war, no plan survives contact with the enemy. Lessons written in blood. The Battle of Mogadishu was not just a military engagement, it was a defining moment. It revealed the strength of the individual soldier, the limits of planning, and the brutal unpredictability of combat in an urban jungle. It showed the world what courage looks like when everything goes wrong, and what loyalty means when giving up is not an option. For Task Force Ranger, the mission became more than a tactical objective. It was a test of human will. The scars of that day run deep, etched into the minds of survivors and military doctrine alike. But in the midst of tragedy, heroism emerged, in the Delta operators who stood their ground, in the Rangers who ran into gunfire for their brothers, and in the quiet resilience of those who endured the night. Mogadishu changed how the United States and the world viewed special operations. It exposed weaknesses but also highlighted unmatched bravery. The lessons learned in the dust of Bakara Market continue to shape modern warfare, urban combat training, and strategic thinking to this day. This was Operation Gothic Serpent. This was Black Hawk Down. And these are the stories that must never be forgotten.